Hello, I am Joshua Burke. I'm the assistant professor of history at Smith College, and I'm here today to introduce the prize winner for the Society of Italian Historical Studies, SIHS, and their prize for early modern history. Medieval and early modern history, I should say, as a medievalist, two medievalists talking to each other. So I'm going to introduce our prize winner, Melissa Vise, and just so you know what we're doing, I'll sort of introduce you and then give the citation of the award, and then hopefully we can get into a conversation about your amazing piece that we're here celebrating today. So Melissa Vise, who's joining us, is currently an associate professor of medieval and Mediterranean history at Washington and Lee. But we have exciting news that you'll be shifting positions in July, and that soon you will be at the University of Virginia as the John Now Associate Professor in history and the Principles of Democracy. So congratulations on that, and it's an exciting year for you because also within the year you'll have your first book coming out, right?
Yes.
It's in January, is that right?
Yes, it's slated for January.
So this is The Unruly Tongue, Speech and Violence in Medieval Italy, which is coming out in the Middle Ages series for the University of Pennsylvania Press. You also have numerous articles out in Speculum, Viator, the American Journal for Legal History, so people can find your work there. And you've had work that's been funded by the Institute of Citizen Scholars, the Mellon Foundation, Medieval Academy of America, the Laura de Bossos Fellowship at Harvard, Institute for Research in the Humanities at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So all those people are supporting your amazing work. And that's what we want to get into today. We want to talk about your article, Compositio, Horizons of Truth in the Decameron and the Notarial Register and Civic Peace Pacts, which appeared in Viator in December of 2022. And the Society for Italian Historical Studies wants me to read the citation of this award. This award was given by a committee consisting of myself, Joshua Burke, but chaired by Daniel Bornstein at Washington University in St. Louis, and Carrie Benet at the New College of Florida. And the committee said, it's a little weird to talk about the committee as if I'm not on it, but what we said was that Professor Vise brings together the divergent worlds of literary and legal scholarship as she explores how seemingly disparate texts, the stories gathered in Boccaccio's tale collections and the peace pacts registered in notaries, construct the pursuit of truth. In so doing, she helps us understand not only the Decameron, but the work of notaries in late medieval Florence. So that's the award. And one of the things that I think is so extraordinary about your work is that you bridge two very, very different fields, and two fields that often are, I would say, technically demanding in legal scholarship and literary analysis, and also have huge, they're hard fields for outsiders to get into in many ways, and have vast bodies of secondary scholarship. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about sort of how you see yourselves moving between those two fields, or why you think you can, what's the value is of bringing these two fields together.
Yeah, sure. So this article actually originated out of my thoughts about how I wanted to get into studying literature because of the work that I do in my first book that's you mentioned is coming out. That's a cultural history of speech. And
Yep.
I work at that problem as a historian. So I work principally using archival sources and legal history. That's sort of my foundation. But as part of that project, notaries came to the fore as these architects of language in high and late medieval Italy. So as I looked more and more at notaries, I came to see some really interesting parallels between the work that they're doing officially and what they do on the side, right? Their literary compositions. And of course, Italian scholars, legal historians principally, have long been aware of the Memoriali archives in Bologna, where notaries were recording poetry in the margins. lots of musical notation, a lot of drawings that might seem to be alien to the legal archive, and yet there they are all over the place. So that's sort of been on my mind for a while. And one of my first positions was at NYU in the Department of Italian Studies. And I got to teach a course on the Italian notary. It was sort of like this amazing, never get to do, so obscure, but people want to take a graduate course on that. So I taught that, and it was a chance to read Boccaccio in particular is the first tale, along with all of the scholarship on notarial life and practice in this context of what it is that the legal system does and what it is that speech does. And that was sort of the genesis, the site of origin for this article. And in studying it that way and studying Decameron from a site of interest in notaries and in the practice of law in particular, because that's one of the big takeaways I hope people come away from the article with, is that studying the practice of law is not the same as studying the theoretical articulations that those same practicing lawyers might put forward. They're often kind of at loggerheads. That tells us something really important, not only about how life worked on the ground, but how literary construction worked in the Italian communes, specifically here with Boccaccio.
Yeah, and so I wanted to follow up that. I mean, you do this really interesting work about embedded narratives, and obviously, right, anyone who's worked with Boccaccio is familiar with the idea of embedded narratives. It's central to how we think about that text and talk about it. But I think we're less familiar with thinking about notarial registers as embedded narratives, right? And so you highlight the way that form sort of functions in both of those texts. And yeah, so you sort of make the case that we can see notarial texts as series of embedded narratives that parallel some of these works in Boccaccio. Right, do you think that's true sort of universally in sort of notarial practice when you're looking at these criminal cases, or did it have to do with the specific cases that you were looking at?
No, I do think that it sort of applies universally. So what's really interesting, like I said, my background comes from paging through for years now, criminal court trials, and you come away from those first with a fairly bleak understanding of humanity, but you also see some patterns that start to emerge, that, and many of which, at least I didn't expect going into it. So one of the things that starts to happen as you're reading these is they're very formulaic. You expect certain things, you can find things quickly because you understand how all the formulas work and they're put together. At the same time, you can find surprising things that break those formulas, and those are always fascinating for me. But anyway, this background has made me very sensitive to form and how form works. I think that on the one hand, notaries have this reputation of being kind of like these typewriters, right? They're not very interesting. They're not people. They're just recording things. But there's more to it than that. And I think anytime humans are involved, there's more to it than that. And that's sort of what interests me, especially when I'm looking at case after case of criminal trials in the archives. And one of the things that you often observe is the way in which they might bundle a series of types of crime together, right? You'll have a run of thefts, and then there'll be a run of murders. And it's not that, medieval Bologna or medieval Florence saw a spree of thefts and then a spree of murders. That's not really what happens. It's just that they chose to bundle those into their registers together because they thought that made sense, right? But they don't always do that.
Right.
And so looking at the ways in which maybe they'd organize a little bit here and there, the types of trials, but they would also be happy to put totally disparate trials side by side. That struck me as something that literary scholars were also wrestling with interpreting Boccaccio's Decameron, right? Because some of the days have a theme, Some of the days say they have a theme, but they don't really. And some of the days don't have a theme at all, but like a stated theme, but then they sort of do coalesce around something.
Right.
And every now and then there's a story that just does not fit. I mean, nobody has really figured out what to do with Griselda, right? So that parallel in form struck me immediately as a reader, as a legal historian coming in to read Boccaccio's Decameron, definitely. Yeah.
And do you think those same structures inform like the individual stories themselves, or is it more, are you more interested in sort of how the stories are, you were talking about sort of the bundling of the stories there, but do you see that same patterns between the notarial work within individual stories that you see in Boccaccio?
Yeah, so I think that there are certain parallels at the individual level, like of the individual trial to the way that
Right.
the tales work. I think Justin Steinberg's recent book has really looked at the stories as individual experiments, legal experiments, as it were. And I think there's something to that. I think that the possibility of experimentation with narrative in these tales, and especially, I mean, there's 100 of them. There are certainly repetitive themes, right? We get some repeat characters, what you might call
Right.
frequent offenders, right? um, and those tend to be the foolish ones, the foolish characters, right? So there's something there at the level of the individual story and trial as well. Now, the individual stories themselves, I think in the article I analyze a few of them that really specifically look towards the construction of future peace as their sort of modus operandi. But there are others as well. And I actually, the book that's coming out will also have a chapter on literature and Decameron in particular, and studies some of those a little bit further.
Yeah, speaking of those notions of future peace, I think everyone sort of, probably most of the people watching this have some idea of like notaries and criminal trials, right? Those are all familiar to us, but the notion of peace pacts, I think, aren't something that's particularly familiar to non-specialists. So can you sort of introduce that idea and walk us through it? Because I want to get it. I think your discussion of peace pacts and the way they serve to construct these imagined futures is fascinating. I want to get into that, but can you tell people about what peace pacts are first?
Sure. So the legal process is called compositio, which is the title of the article, right. Composition, which is, just a really telling sort of name to work with if you're pairing that with literature. And so basically you compose a piece that is a peace pact, a notarial instrument for peace, for any number of reasons. So for some places, it would be to stave off a trial that is coming your way, right? Say you've assaulted somebody, you might approach them and say, hey, can we make a peace pact? Obviously, there are troubling power dynamics in that particular exchange. Right. The trial may have already taken place and you, the assaulting individual, have been banned from the city, and maybe through intermediaries, you approach the victim and say, can we make a peace pact so I can come back? Those are two of the classic ways in which peace pacts might be made. You'll also have peace pacts formed between parties who are experiencing or creating a story of vendetta together, right? And so they might try to use a legal peace pact, even if no trial is on the horizon or anything, to try to stabilize power relations between the two of them. So peace pacts are used in a number of different ways. They've often been considered in legal history as a sign of extrajudicial justice. That is, it's not real justice because it doesn't stem from a courtroom finding, and that that's what real justice is supposed to look like. But of course, out of court settlements are a norm in modern jurisprudence. Right. Whether for problematic reasons or for great reasons, right? And so it was very similar in the medieval communes. What has been more recent in the legal scholarship is the realization that actually peace pacts did not decline with the advent of Inquisition, which had previously been seen as a more rational or scientific approach
Right.
to the law. In fact, they increased. And so people like Massimo Vallarani, Kate Jansen, Shona Kelly-Ray before she passed, all of these folks have been building this literature, this study of the role of peace pacts in the systems of justice and in the communes writ large. And it's been really, really important.
Yeah. I mean, and
Well,
you sort of talk about them as these moments, right? That the peace pact isn't concerned necessarily with the truth of the past, but in sort of building these communal futures, right? Not the world as is, but as the world it is becoming.
it's very rare that they'll talk about, what really happened, who's at
Right.
fault, who wasn't. One of the really important things about the peace pact is that they kind of try to move beyond that discussion and say, okay, here's what's going to happen in the future. If either of us break the peace, here's the fine. I'm going to pledge my life or my goods as proof that I'm not going to break this peace pact so that we will be peaceful moving forward. There's a lot of talk about what the future should look like. And only rarely will you get any kind of extended discussion about, the crime or the assault or whatever it was that happened before, particularly in cases of vendetta. You might get some reference to the enmity and hatred that had existed between two groups, but that's going to be the most of it, right? Because their interest is something else.
So how does that bring us back to the realm of literature and
Sure.
Boccaccio?
So with Boccaccio, right, the project in Decameron, as I see it, is to sketch the possibility of a return, right? A return to a Florence that has been decimated by plague. Notably, Boccaccio constructs in the introduction a Florence that is totally lost, right, in every way, which historians now know maybe we don't take this at face value as an accurate representation of what actually plague in Florence looked like. But it's important for his project that Florence begins as a site of chaos, disorder, and the lack of human compassion. The moving away from Florence to Fiesole to have these telling of tales is an attempt to look towards the future, towards reconstructing that civic horizon through storytelling, through that generative act, that is the creative act of storytelling, the sketching of a future that is not yet here, right? Which I think is something very similar to what the peace pacts are doing. And importantly, in both, you're not necessarily going to get some sort of the kind of harmony of equitable power relations. No, a lot of those things are going to come back and repeat, right? It's sort of like, that's why I refer to it in an article as the horizon. They're trying to go there. They don't get there, right?
Right.
Even on their return, even when the Merry Company, the Brigata, returns to, is headed back to Florence, there are problems that they're bringing back with them.
Do you think, and I'm asking you to certainly move beyond the article and being like widely speculative here, but like in this right, I was struck by hearing you say that, right? We're at sort of a moment now of where there's a big stress on narratives of civic disruption, civic chaos, desires for a return to some state of normalcy on a number of like vectors and valences for people of a number of sort of different political views. Do you think, is there something about the historical moment that we are in now that you think gives you a unique perspective or sort of pushed you towards this notion of sort of the moving away from the truth of the past and constructing these new communal futures, right? Is there something about the moment that we're in now that you think that like speaks to this work or this model that you're creating?
So what's really interesting about the modern parallels, of course, when we're looking at the medieval communes, is that is the Republican context, right? And the simple fact that the construction of a Republican future always trades on words and narrative, right? That is built communally and requires trust in other members of the community for building. And I think that because that is an echo in our modern world that was also true of Boccaccio's Florence. Boccaccio himself was heavily involved in the political life. He took on a number of offices once he returned to Florence from Naples. And so in part, there's a political parallel that's in some ways real, right? Florence is in a long crisis of Republican life. The experiment has been troubled for quite some time, right? And so there's something there. I think that what's really interesting about thinking about the project of Republican life and civic harmony in terms of a horizon, although Boccaccio stages it as a return, I say in the article, it's not really a return because it's not nostalgic. It's not trying to go back to another time to create something that once was. That's not the goal. Instead, it's to create whatever comes next on present realities, right? And of course, that is a conversation happening in the modern political context.
Absolutely.
And so these competing demands, the allure of nostalgia and the exciting but also scary possibilities of what could be the future, something we're wrestling with.
Yeah, so can you tell me how this work sort of fits into the larger book project and
so this piece is kind of it's a bit of a bridge piece from the first project moving into the second. So the first book project is really trying to understand how it was that medieval Italians came to understand that words could cause true and prosecutable damage. Essentially, in medieval Italy, you could take your neighbor to court for insulting you. And these were important laws that entered the books, first and foremost, to defend the popolo, that is the sort of middle class of artisans and merchants who came to power in the late 13th century. They brought these into the books to protect themselves from magnate insults, that is from the upper classes. And that's a really interesting phenomenon for us to think about because it suggests the policing of speech to protect those who were previously disenfranchised, which is sort of alien to how we think about speech in the Republic, right?
Can I jump in here and just ask?
Oh, sure.
Just because I'm curious. I've been talking about. I've been teaching a number of early Germanic law codes to my students, right? And Germanic customary law seems to have had those same penalties for insults, right? And students are always, I think, really surprised when they see them, that if you call someone a fox, you have to pay a certain fine, right? Which shows up in the SIHS law. So is there a time when those go away? And then, because you talked about them as you talked about the popolo sort of bringing these into the law codes in the 13th century.
Yeah, they weren't there. They aren't part of Roman law in the same way, and they won't, which is of course what's animating life in the communes. In the communes, you have this coming together of customary law and Romanic law and local ordinances, which may or may not have anything to do with either, right? And so it's this really interesting mix of things. What I find fascinating about what's going on in the communes is that what comes into law at that time with the rise of the popolo is something that is a product, right? It is coming from other elements at work in the construction of the republics. Principally the constructions of the fields of rhetoric, the art of public speaking, all of these things that develop uniquely in the Italian context, they're the product of that. So, we see certain legal moments in European history where certain polities choose to prosecute certain forms of criminal speech, but we don't see this engine, as it were, at work that sort of moves through all fields of a culture, the science of that culture, the religious and the understanding of sins of the tongue, which is new at this time, in the political life, in political treatises, right? So it's all coming together to create law, right? Law is sort of comes later in this instance. So and then I go in and look at the way that literature then sort of reflects on some of these moments, what's going on within this society. So this piece is interested, the piece in Viator was interested in looking at this parallel, the way in which we can do a kind of cultural history. Yes, bring together two, I suppose you could say, imposing edifices of historiography together, because I think it's really valuable to study these moments from a much wider perspective, from a cultural perspective. And moving forward, I'm starting to work with an anti-vendetta treatise, a dialogue actually written by another notary, my favorite one, Albertano da Brescia. And he's writing in the middle of the 13th century, and he's trying to convince his fellow citizens not to take vendetta when they're insulted or assaulted, which is, as you might guess, a tall order for the Italian cities. And it's not clear it worked. But what's really interesting in that text is this understanding of the way in which peace comes about, not necessarily, first and foremost, through juridical means, but perhaps more so as a measure of grief. That is, the parties coming into a peace pact, the aggrieved parties need to feel a sense of peace about their grief. And that's something that I'm working on in the next project.
Well, and one of the ideas you started with, and I'm curious to see sort of how it applies to both these situations that you just described in your upcoming book project and in your next one, is that the disconnect between law as theorized and law as practiced, right? Specifically talking about like the policing of speech. You talked about the political rhetoric around that. Do you see that same kind of, is there a significant divide between like the rhetoric around speech and then what we actually see from the various court records?
Yeah, so one of the things that is really interesting about the history of speech and the prosecution of speech in the communes is that the prosecution of what are deemed to be criminal speech acts takes place before their instantiation into statute, even statute law, right? So forget about the theories and the deliberations and the concilia, they're all coming. There aren't even statutes when people are starting to prosecute each other in court. And this is one of the reasons that, for me, studying the practice of law as that which then generates theory is really important. Yeah.
Right. And sort of reversing that relationship that we sort of tend to think exists. Well, thank you so much for making the time for this. This is a really fascinating article. I wish we had more time to talk. Hopefully we'll get a chance to see each other in the future and continue these conversations. So thank you again. Thank you for the Italian to the Italian Historical Society for mounting this video. And thank you for composing the article.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.